She said I was confusing the children with outdated and that my presence was disruptive to their modern upbringing. So they limited my visits, monitored my conversations, and eventually suggested I find more appropriate ways to spend my time. What they didn't expect was that I would take their advice so literally. My name is Margaret Sullivan, and at 71 years old, I discovered that sometimes the best way to prove you're not too old to matter is to show an entire classroom of children that wisdom never goes out of style. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I had always been Margaret Sullivan, but for 34 years, I was also Mrs. Sullivan to hundreds of fourth graders at PS 168 in Queens. That brick building on Northern Boulevard had been my second home since 1987, when I first walked through its doors as a young teacher fresh from Queens College, with a degree in elementary education and a head full of dreams about shaping young minds. The classroom was my kingdom. Room 204 had tall windows that caught the morning light just right, casting golden squares across the rows of small desks I had arranged in what I called conversation clusters, rather than rigid lines. The walls were covered with student artwork, motivational posters I had laminated myself, and a large world map where we would place pins for every country we studied. In the corner sat a reading nook, with donated beanbags and a bookshelf I had painted sky blue one summer, filled with everything from picture books to chapter novels that challenged my students to reach higher. I wasn't just a teacher, I was a detective of potential. Some children came to me reading at a second grade level, others were already devouring books meant for middle schoolers. My job wasn't to make them all the same. It was to meet each child exactly where they were and help them take their next step forward. I had learned to spot the quiet ones who needed encouragement, the restless ones who needed movement, and the advanced ones who needed challenge. Every September brought a new puzzle of personalities, learning styles, and backgrounds that I would spend the year figuring out and fitting together. My teaching philosophy was simple. Children are naturally curious, and curiosity is the foundation of all learning. I never talked down to them or oversimplified concepts. When we studied the solar system, I didn't just tell them the planets' names. I had them calculate the distances, imagine the temperatures, and write letters to NASA asking real questions. When we read Charlotte's Web, we didn't just discuss the plot. We researched spider behavior, visited a local farm, and wrote our own stories about friendship and sacrifice. The parents trusted me. They would linger after pickup, asking about their children's progress, sharing concerns about homework struggles or friendship drama. I kept detailed notes on every student, not just their academic performance, but their personalities, their family situations, their dreams. I knew that Tommy's parents were divorcing, that Maria was struggling with English at home, that David had been diagnosed with ADHD and needed specific strategies to succeed. I tailored my approach to each child because I understood that teaching wasn't about delivering information. It was about connecting with human beings. My own family was proud of my work. My husband Robert, who had worked as a mechanic for the MTA, would often joke that I cared more about other people's children than my own. But our son Michael knew better. He had grown up understanding that his mother had a calling, and he respected the dedication it required. When he was young, he would sometimes come to my classroom after school, helping me clean erasers or organize supplies. He saw firsthand how his mother interacted with students, how she stayed late to help struggling learners, how she spent her own money on classroom supplies when the school budget fell short. But teaching wasn't just my profession, it was my identity. I woke up every morning thinking about my students. I planned lessons while grocery shopping, spotting teaching opportunities in everyday experiences. The grocery store became a math lesson about budgeting and percentages. The museum became a history lesson about civilizations and cultures. The park became a science lesson about ecosystems and weather patterns. My mind was always working, always looking for ways to make learning come alive. I had a reputation in the school for being both demanding and nurturing. My students knew I had high expectations, but they also knew I would provide whatever support they needed to meet those expectations. I stayed after school for extra help sessions. I called parents when I noticed changes in behavior or academic performance. I attended school plays, sporting events, and graduation ceremonies for years after my students had moved on, because once you were in my classroom, you became part of my extended family. The rewards were immeasurable. There were the obvious victories: improved test scores, reluctant readers discovering their love of books, shy students finding their voices. But there were also the smaller moments that meant everything. A child's face lighting up when they finally understood a difficult concept, a thank you note from a parent, a former student stopping by years later to tell me how something I had taught them had made a difference in their life. I had a special gift for reaching the children others had written off. Marcus, who came to me labeled as behavioral problem, became one of my most enthusiastic learners once I discovered his passion for dinosaurs and incorporated paleontology into our science curriculum. Sarah, who had been held back a grade and was convinced she was stupid, blossomed when I helped her recognize that her mind worked differently, not deficiently. These were the children who reminded me why I had chosen this profession in the first place. My retirement in 2021 was bittersweet. The school threw me a party in the gymnasium, and former students from across the decades came to wish me well. Some were now adults with children of their own, successful in careers I had helped them imagine. The principal presented me with a plaque that read, "Margaret Sullivan, 34 years of inspiring young minds." But the real treasures were the handwritten letters from students and parents, telling me how I had changed their lives, how I had believed in them when they didn't believe in themselves. I left teaching not because I was burned out or disillusioned, but because I was ready for the next chapter. Robert and I had plans to travel, to spend more time with our grandchildren, to finally tackle the home improvement projects we had been putting off for years. I was excited about having the freedom to pursue my own interests after decades of dedicating myself to others. What I didn't anticipate was how much I would miss the classroom. The daily routine, the constant intellectual stimulation, the sense of purpose that came from knowing I was making a difference. I had spent so many years defining myself as a teacher that I wasn't quite sure who Margaret Sullivan was without a classroom full of 9-year-olds depending on her. But I was about to find out that once a teacher, always a teacher, and that sometimes the most important lessons are taught outside the traditional classroom walls. I just had to learn that the hard way, through a family crisis that would challenge everything I thought I knew about my role as a grandmother and force me to rediscover my purpose in ways I never could have imagined. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The changes began subtly, like a slow leak in a pipe that you don't notice until the water damage becomes impossible to ignore. After Robert's funeral in the spring of 2022, my son Michael and his wife Jennifer seemed to hover around me with a new kind of attention that felt both caring and suffocating. They would arrive at my Forest Hills apartment unannounced, armed with grocery bags and concerned expressions, scanning my living space like inspectors looking for violations. "Mom, you really should consider getting one of those medical alert necklaces," Jennifer would say, straightening throw pillows that didn't need straightening. "What if something happens and you can't reach the phone?" She spoke in that tone people use when they think they're being helpful but are actually being patronizing. The same tone I had heard parents use with teachers when they thought they knew better than the professionals. Michael, my sweet boy who had once defended my teaching methods to skeptical friends, now seemed to question every decision I made. When I mentioned wanting to take a pottery class at the community center, he exchanged glances with Jennifer before suggesting that maybe I should take things easy for a while. When I talked about volunteering at the local library, Jennifer wondered aloud if I was taking on too much in my grief. The real trouble began when it came to my grandchildren, Emma, age 8, and Jacob, age 10. These were the lights of my life, Robert's legacy and mine. Two bright, curious souls who reminded me daily why I had chosen to dedicate my life to children. Emma had inherited my love of stories and would curl up in my lap for hours while I read to her. Jacob was fascinated by history and would pepper me with questions about what life was like in the old days, which I answered with patience and detail, helping him understand that the past wasn't just dates and names, but real people living real lives. But Jennifer had ideas about appropriate grandparent behavior, and apparently, I wasn't meeting her standards. It started with small corrections. When I taught Emma how to make paper airplanes during one of their visits, Jennifer quickly intervened. "We're trying to encourage more quiet activities, Margaret. All that running around gets her too wound up." When I helped Jacob with his homework, showing him a different approach to long division that I had successfully used with thousands of students, Jennifer stepped in again. "We really prefer that he learns it the way his teacher showed him. We don't want to confuse him with old methods." Old methods. The phrase stung more than Jennifer probably intended. Everything I had learned in my 34 years of teaching was suddenly old. The strategies that had helped countless children succeed were now confusing. The patience and creativity that had earned me recognition from colleagues and parents were now seen as outdated interference. The criticism became more frequent and more pointed. When I took the children to the Natural History Museum, a place I had visited with hundreds of students over the years, Jennifer was furious. "You should have asked permission first," she said when they returned home, excited and full of questions about dinosaurs and ancient civilizations. "We have a specific educational plan for them, and random outings disrupt their learning schedule." I had spent 3 decades creating educational experiences that sparked curiosity and wonder in children. I had taken students on field trips that opened their minds to new possibilities, helped them see connections between classroom learning and the real world. But now, doing the same thing with my own grandchildren was seen as disruptive and inappropriate. The rules began to multiply. I couldn't give them snacks without checking with Jennifer first. Apparently, the homemade cookies I had been baking for children for decades were now too sugary and would ruin their dinner. I couldn't read them bedtime stories when they slept over, because Jennifer had a specific bedtime routine that didn't include overstimulating activities like storytelling. I couldn't help them with art projects because Jennifer was concerned about mess and wanted to preserve their natural creativity without adult interference. Each restriction felt like a small betrayal. I had raised Michael to be independent, curious, and confident. I had encouraged his questions, supported his interests, and given him the freedom to explore and learn. Now his wife seemed determined to shield their children from the same kind of engaged, hands-on grandparenting that had been such a cornerstone of my own family's relationships. The breaking point came during a family dinner at their home in Westchester. Emma had been struggling with a reading assignment, and I could see the frustration building in her little face as she tried to sound out unfamiliar words. My teacher instincts kicked in automatically. I moved to sit beside her, pointing out phonetic patterns and offering gentle encouragement. Within minutes, Emma was reading with confidence, her face glowing with pride. "That's enough, Margaret," Jennifer said sharply, appearing at my elbow. "Emma needs to learn to work through challenges independently. We don't want her becoming dependent on adult help." She scooped up the book and guided Emma away from the table. "Go play with your brother, sweetheart. Grandma needs to let you figure things out on your own." I sat there, stunned. In my classroom, I had been praised for recognizing when a child needed support and providing it without making them feel inadequate. I had helped thousands of children overcome reading difficulties, building their confidence while teaching them strategies they could use independently. But now, offering the same support to my own granddaughter was seen as creating unhealthy dependence. That night, Michael walked me to my car with an expression I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, trying to explain why he had missed curfew. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something," he said, his voice careful and rehearsed. "Jennifer and I have been discussing your interactions with the kids, and we think maybe you need to step back a little." Step back. From my own grandchildren. From the 2 people who brought me more joy than anything else in my life since Robert's death. "What do you mean, step back?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "You have a tendency to take over," he continued, not meeting my eyes. "You're always trying to teach them things or fix problems for them. We think that you're not letting them develop their own problem-solving skills. You're confusing them with outdated teaching methods, and you're undermining our parenting approach." There it was. The word that had been lurking underneath all the small criticisms and gentle corrections. Confusing. As if 3 decades of successful teaching experience was now a liability. As if my love for these children was somehow harmful to them. "I'm not trying to undermine anyone," I said quietly. I'm just trying to be a good grandmother. I'm doing what I've always done, helping children learn and grow. But that's the problem, Mom. You're treating them like they're your students instead of your grandchildren. You're always in teacher mode, and it's not appropriate anymore. They need their grandmother to just be a grandmother, not an educator. The words hit me like a physical blow. How do you separate being a grandmother from being an educator, when education and nurturing have been inseparable parts of your identity for your entire adult life? How do you stop seeing opportunities to help children learn and grow when that's what you've been trained to do, when that's what brought you joy and purpose for decades? I drove home that night with tears blurring my vision, not from sadness, but from a growing anger that I barely recognized. I had spent my career advocating for children, believing that every adult in a child's life should be invested in their growth and development. I had seen the damage that occurred when children were caught between adults who couldn't work together for their benefit. And now I was being told that my investment in my own grandchildren's development was the problem. As I sat in my apartment that night, surrounded by the teaching awards and thank you notes from former students that covered my walls, I realized that I was facing a choice. I could accept their judgment, step back as requested, and watch from the sidelines as my grandchildren grew up. I could become the type of grandmother who sent birthday cards and holiday gifts but had no real impact on their lives. Or I could find another way to matter. Another way to use the skills and experience that had defined me for so long. Another way to prove that there was nothing outdated about caring deeply about children's education and development. Knew it? I just didn't know yet what that other way would look like. But I was beginning to suspect that Jennifer's criticism might have unintentionally pointed me toward the perfect solution. The restrictions didn't stop with that conversation. If anything, Jennifer seemed emboldened by Michael's support, and what had been suggestions became rules, enforced with the precision of a military operation. My visits to their Westchester home, which had once been spontaneous and joy-filled, became scheduled appointments with predetermined agendas. "We think it's better if you call first," Jennifer explained during one of our increasingly awkward phone conversations. "The kids have such busy schedules now. Soccer practice, violin lessons, tutoring sessions. We need to make sure your visits don't interfere with their commitments." She spoke as if spending time with their grandmother was now an optional activity, something to be squeezed in between more important obligations. I began to notice how Jennifer positioned herself as the gatekeeper of all interactions. When I arrived for my allotted 2-hour Sunday visits, she would greet me at the door with a bright smile and a subtle list of restrictions. "Emma's having some trouble with emotional regulation lately, so we're keeping things very calm and structured today." Or, "Jacob's teacher says he needs to work on following directions exactly as given, so please don't offer alternative ways to do things." The children themselves seemed different around me now, more cautious, less spontaneous. Emma, who had once climbed onto my lap without hesitation, now glanced toward her mother before approaching me. Jacob, who had bombarded me with questions about everything from how televisions work to why leaves change color, became quiet and reserved, offering polite but distant responses to my attempts at conversation. I realized that Jennifer had been coaching them. Not maliciously, perhaps, but effectively. She had explained to them that Grandma Margaret sometimes got too excited about teaching, and that they should remember to listen to Mommy and Daddy's instructions first. She had framed my enthusiasm for their education as something that needed to be managed, controlled, and ultimately minimized. The phone calls became less frequent too. Where Emma used to call me after school to tell me about her day, now Jennifer would call on their behalf, providing sanitized summaries of their activities. "Emma had a good day at school," she would report. "She's working on her reading comprehension." But when I asked to speak with Emma directly, Jennifer would explain that she was busy with homework or having some quiet time. I began to feel like I was visiting strangers rather than my own family. The easy intimacy I had shared with my grandchildren was being systematically dismantled, replaced by supervised interactions that felt more like formal visits than family time. I was being transformed from a beloved grandmother into a peripheral figure, someone to be tolerated rather than cherished. The breaking point came during what would be my last invitation to a family dinner. Jennifer had prepared what she called a kid-friendly meal: chicken nuggets, French fries, and apple slices arranged with the precision of a restaurant presentation. As we sat around their dining room table, I watched my grandchildren eating in near silence, their natural chatter replaced by careful attention to their mother's expectations. Emma dropped a French fry on the floor and immediately looked stricken. "I'm sorry, Mommy," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't mean to make a mess." My heart broke. This was a child who had once giggled while we made cookies together, flour dusting every surface of my kitchen. Now she was apologizing for a minor accident, as if it were a major transgression. "It's okay, sweetheart," I said gently, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "Accidents happen. That's why we have napkins and paper towels." Jennifer's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Emma knows the rules about being careful with her food," she said, her tone sharp. "She needs to learn natural consequences for her actions." She turned to Emma with a stern expression. "You'll need to clean that up yourself, and you'll eat the rest of your meal extra carefully." I watched as my 8-year-old granddaughter slid from her chair and crawled under the table to retrieve the fallen French fry, her small shoulders trembling with embarrassment. Everything in my teacher's soul rebelled against this response. A spilled piece of food was not a moral failing that required punishment and shame. It was a normal part of childhood, an opportunity for gentle guidance, and perhaps a lesson about cleaning up after ourselves. But I was no longer allowed to provide that perspective. I was supposed to sit silently while my granddaughter was made to feel ashamed for being a normal child. After dinner, I attempted to connect with Jacob, who had been unusually quiet throughout the meal. "How's school going, buddy?" I asked, settling beside him on the couch. "Are you still working on that Civil War project?" His face lit up for a moment. The first genuine expression I had seen from him all evening. "Yes. We're learning about the Battle of Gettysburg, and I found this really cool book about—" "Jacob," Jennifer interrupted from the kitchen, "remember what we talked about regarding monopolizing conversations. Let other people have a chance to speak too." Jacob's excitement died instantly. He looked down at his hands and mumbled, "Sorry, Grandma, I didn't mean to talk too much." I felt something inside me break. This was a child who had inherited my love of history, who had spent hours with me exploring museums and historical sites, who had once peppered me with questions about the past because he was genuinely curious about the world. Now he was being taught to suppress that curiosity, to apologize for his enthusiasm, to treat his interests as burdens that others had to endure. "You weren't talking too much," I said quietly, but Jennifer's sharp look warned me not to continue. Jacob had already withdrawn into himself, the moment of connection lost. As I prepared to leave that evening, Michael walked me to my car with the same uncomfortable expression he had worn during our previous difficult conversation. "Mom, I need to ask you something," he said, his voice strained. "Jennifer's been feeling like you're not respecting our parenting boundaries. She thinks maybe you need some time to adjust to your new role." "What new role?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand exactly what he meant. "As their grandmother, not their teacher. You keep trying to educate them and guide them, but that's our job now. Jennifer thinks, and I agree, that maybe you should limit your visits for a while. Give everyone some space to figure out healthier dynamics." There it was. The final verdict. I was being officially removed from my grandchildren's lives, not because I had done anything harmful, but because I loved them too much. Because I saw potential in them that I wanted to nurture. Because I refused to treat them like fragile objects that might break if exposed to too much learning or too much affection. "How long is a while?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Michael shrugged uncomfortably. "We'll see. Maybe after the holidays." Jennifer thinks the kids need time to bond with their parents without outside influence. Outside influence. That's what I had become. The woman who had changed their diapers, who had rocked them to sleep, who had been the first person they called when they were proud of an accomplishment or needed comfort during a difficult day, was now considered an outside influence. I drove home that night with a clarity that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger required energy I didn't have. I wasn't even particularly sad, though I knew the grief would come later. What I felt was a strange sense of liberation, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had suddenly been lifted. Jennifer had made her position clear. I was bad for the children. My teaching instincts, my educational background, my natural tendency to nurture and guide young minds, all of it was unwanted, unwelcome, and inappropriate. I was expected to disappear from their lives, to become a memory they might fondly recall when they were older, but who had no real impact on their development. But as I sat in my apartment that night, surrounded by decades of evidence that I was actually quite good with children, I realized that Jennifer had inadvertently given me the perfect challenge. She believed I was bad for kids. She thought my teaching methods were outdated and harmful. She wanted me to stay away from children altogether. I was about to prove her spectacularly wrong, not by fighting for access to my grandchildren. That battle was lost, at least for now, but by showing the world that Margaret Sullivan still had something valuable to offer young minds. The question was no longer whether I would continue to work with children, but how I would find my way back to them, and I had a feeling I knew exactly where to start. Bo. The idea came to me while I was standing in line at the grocery store, watching a mother struggle with her 7-year-old son, who was having a complete meltdown over a candy bar. The child was crying, the mother was frustrated, and everyone around them was either staring or pointedly looking away. But I saw something different. I saw a tired little boy who was probably hungry, overwhelmed by the bright lights and crowded aisles, and desperately trying to communicate his needs in the only way he knew how. My teacher instincts kicked in automatically. I wanted to crouch down to his level, speak to him in a calm voice, maybe suggest a compromise or distraction technique, but I caught myself before moving, remembering Jennifer's words about my inappropriate tendency to intervene with children. I was supposed to mind my own business, to let parents handle their own situations without my outdated input. But as I watched the situation escalate, with the mother growing more embarrassed and the child becoming more distressed, I realized something profound. Jennifer's criticism had been wrong from the beginning. The problem wasn't that I was bad for children. It was that I was good with them, and that threatened her sense of control. That night, I pulled out my laptop and began researching something I hadn't thought about in years: substitute teaching. I had maintained my teaching certification even after retirement, more out of habit than any real plan to use it. But now I wondered if there might be opportunities for someone with my experience to step back into the classroom, even temporarily. The New York City Department of Education website was a maze of forms and requirements, but I navigated it with the same determination I had once used to decode new curriculum standards. I discovered that they were desperately short of substitute teachers, particularly in elementary schools. The pandemic had created a shortage that still hadn't been resolved, and they were actively recruiting retired teachers to fill the gaps. I spent the next week updating my resume, gathering references, and completing the required paperwork. It felt strange to be selling myself professionally again after being told I was no longer qualified to help children learn. But with each form I filled out, each reference letter I requested, I felt a familiar energy returning, the excitement of a new challenge, the anticipation of stepping back into an environment where my skills were valued rather than criticized. The first call came on a Tuesday morning. PS 158 in the Bronx needed a 4th-grade substitute for the day. The teacher had called in sick, and they were desperate for someone with elementary experience. I accepted immediately, my heart racing with a mixture of nervousness and excitement I hadn't felt in years. I spent the rest of the morning preparing like I was going to my first job interview. I chose my outfit carefully, professional but approachable, the kind of clothes that said, "I'm here to work, not to play." I packed a small bag with supplies I thought might be useful: colorful pens, stickers, a few books I had collected over the years, and some simple games that could be adapted for any subject. The school was in a neighborhood I didn't know well, housed in a building that looked like it had seen better days. The hallways were painted in institutional colors, and the floors showed the wear of thousands of small feet. But the moment I walked through those doors, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. I felt at home. The principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, greeted me with the kind of grateful relief that told me everything I needed to know about how difficult it had been to find coverage. "Thank you so much for coming in on short notice," she said, walking me quickly toward the classroom. Mrs. Patterson left detailed lesson plans, but honestly, just keeping them engaged and learning something will be a victory. The classroom was chaos when I arrived. 26 4th graders were running around unsupervised, having been told that their teacher was sick but not given any information about what would happen next. Some were crying, others were fighting over supplies, and a few were trying to hide under desks. The noise level was overwhelming, and I could see why whoever had been watching them before I arrived had probably fled. But I wasn't intimidated. I had walked into similar situations countless times over my career, and I knew exactly what to do. I didn't raise my voice or demand attention. Instead, I moved to the front of the room, picked up a piece of chalk, and began drawing on the blackboard. Within minutes, curious children began to gather around, trying to figure out what I was creating. "I'm Mrs. Sullivan," I said quietly, continuing to draw. "I'm here to spend the day with you while Mrs. Patterson gets better. But first, I need to know something very important about each of you." The room gradually quieted as more children moved closer to see what I was doing. I had drawn a simple map of the United States, and I was marking different states with small symbols. "I need to know where each of you is from," I continued. "Not just where you live now, but where your family comes from. Because I'm going to tell you a secret. Every single person in this room has an incredible story, and I want to hear all of them." For the next hour, I had those children completely captivated. They told me about grandparents who had come from Puerto Rico, Mexico, Jamaica, and Italy. They shared stories about parents who had grown up in different states, about family traditions that had been passed down through generations, about languages spoken at home that were different from the English they used at school. And as they talked, I wove their stories into impromptu lessons. Maria's family's journey from El Salvador became a geography lesson about Central America. Kevin's grandmother's stories about growing up in Georgia during the Civil Rights Movement became a history lesson about social change. Ahmed's description of his family's celebration of Ramadan became a cultural studies lesson about different religious traditions. By lunchtime, these children weren't just engaged, they were excited about learning. They were asking questions, making connections, and volunteering information about their families and experiences. They had transformed from a chaotic group of abandoned students into a collaborative learning community. But the real test came in the afternoon, when I had to tackle the lesson plan Mrs. Patterson had left, a math worksheet on long division that was supposed to keep them busy for an hour. I looked at the photocopied page, rows of problems with no context, no connection to their lives, no reason for them to care about the answers. Instead of distributing the worksheets, I pulled out my phone and showed them a picture of a pizza. "Who can tell me about the last time their family ordered pizza?" I asked. Hands shot up around the room. I listened as they described family pizza nights, debates over toppings, arguments about how many slices each person should get. Then I posed the question that changed everything. If your family orders 3 large pizzas for 12 people, how do you make sure everyone gets a fair share? Suddenly, long division wasn't just numbers on a page. It was a real problem they needed to solve. I guided them through the process, showing them how division helped them figure out fair distribution, how it connected to fractions when someone wanted an extra slice, how it related to budgeting when they calculated the cost per person. By the end of the day, those children had mastered long division not because they had completed a worksheet, but because they understood why it mattered. They had learned geography, history, cultural studies, and mathematics, not because it was in the curriculum, but because it was connected to their lives and experiences. As I packed up my things that afternoon, several children approached me with a question that made my heart soar. "Mrs. Sullivan, are you coming back tomorrow?" I wasn't scheduled to return, but I promised them I would try to come back soon. As I walked to my car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. The deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've made a difference in a child's life. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a profound sense of clarity. Jennifer had been wrong about me being bad for children. The problem hadn't been my teaching methods or my approach to education. The problem had been that I was trying to use my gifts in an environment where they weren't wanted or appreciated. But in that Bronx classroom, surrounded by children who hungered for connection and meaningful learning, I had remembered who I really was. I was Margaret Sullivan, and I was very, very good at helping children discover their potential. The question now wasn't whether I would continue substitute teaching. It was how quickly I could build a reputation that would keep me busy in classrooms across the city. And whether, just maybe, Word might eventually reach two particular children in Westchester about their grandmother who had become the favorite teacher of hundreds of kids just like them. Within 2 weeks of that first day at PS 158, my phone was ringing constantly. It started with Mrs. Rodriguez calling me back for 3 more days that same week, then spreading the word to other principals in the district. Apparently, word had gotten out that there was a substitute teacher who didn't just babysit, she actually taught. The calls came from schools I had never heard of, in neighborhoods across Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. PS 201 in Jamaica needed someone for a week-long assignment when their third-grade teacher had to have emergency surgery. IS 145 in Crown Heights was desperate for coverage in their special education classroom when their regular teacher went on maternity leave. Each assignment brought new challenges, new children, and new opportunities to prove that my decades of experience weren't outdated. They were invaluable. At PS 201, I walked into Mrs. Chen's third-grade classroom to find 28 children and a note that simply said, "Good luck. The lesson plans are on my desk. Try to keep them from destroying the room." The regular teacher had clearly been struggling, and the children's behavior reflected months of inconsistent expectations and academic frustration. I spent the first hour not teaching curriculum, but establishing what I called our classroom community. I had learned long ago that children can't learn effectively when they don't feel safe, respected, and valued. So instead of jumping into the planned math lesson, I sat with them in a circle and asked each child to share one thing they were proud of about themselves and one thing they hoped to learn while I was there. Pasako Hafed. The responses broke my heart and filled me with determination. 8-year-old Destiny said she was proud that she could read some words now, but she hoped to learn to read like the smart kids. 9-year-old Marcus shared that he was proud of helping his little sister with her homework, but he hoped to learn why numbers were so confusing. These children had been taught to see themselves as struggling learners rather than young minds full of potential. Over the next week, I systematically rebuilt their confidence while accelerating their learning. I discovered that Destiny wasn't behind because she lacked ability. She was behind because no one had ever taught her phonics systematically. Marcus wasn't confused by numbers because he was bad at math. He was confused because abstract concepts had never been connected to his concrete experiences. By Friday, Destiny was reading at grade level, and Marcus was helping other children with fraction problems. But more importantly, the entire classroom dynamic had changed. Children who had been disruptive became engaged. Students who had been withdrawn became participatory. The room that had been chaotic became collaborative. When Mrs. Chen returned from her surgery, she found detailed notes about every child's progress, organized lesson plans that built on their interests and strengths, and 28 thank you cards from students who wanted to make sure she knew how much they had learned. She called the principal immediately, asking if there was any way to keep me permanently. The assignment at IS 145 presented different challenges. Special education students often face low expectations and watered-down curriculum. But I had learned in my regular teaching career that children with learning differences aren't less capable. They simply need different approaches. The Class 1 inherited had been receiving what I called coloring book education. Busy work designed to keep them occupied rather than meaningful instruction designed to help them grow. I threw out the worksheets and started from scratch. For students with attention difficulties, I created lessons that incorporated movement and hands-on activities. For children with processing issues, I developed multisensory approaches that engaged multiple pathways to learning. For students who had been labeled as behavior problems, I discovered that most of their disruptions disappeared when they were given appropriately challenging work that matched their learning styles. The breakthrough came with a student named Anthony, who had been classified as having severe behavioral issues. His file was thick with incident reports, suspension records, and notes about his aggressive tendencies. But when I observed him carefully, I noticed that his outbursts always occurred during reading time, and they seemed to stem from frustration rather than defiance. I suspected dyslexia, but his previous teachers had focused on his behavior rather than investigating the underlying cause. I spent extra time with him, using techniques I had learned for helping students with reading difficulties. Within days, his behavior problems virtually disappeared. When he could access the learning, he no longer needed to act out to avoid it. His improvement was so dramatic that his parents requested a meeting. They arrived expecting to discuss his latest disciplinary issues, but instead found themselves listening to detailed reports about his academic progress and positive social interactions. His mother actually cried when I showed her his reading improvement charts. "No one ever told us he was smart," she said through her tears. "Every teacher meeting has been about how he's a problem, how he can't sit still, how he disrupts the class. You're the first person who's ever talked about what he can do instead of what he can't do." That conversation crystallized something I had been feeling in every classroom I entered. These children weren't broken or deficient. They had been failed by a system that didn't understand their needs or believe in their potential. Jennifer's criticism of my teaching methods as outdated was exactly backward. What was outdated was the assumption that all children learn the same way, that struggling students need less challenging work, that behavioral issues are character flaws rather than communication about unmet needs. Word of my success spread through the informal networks that connect schools across the city. Principals began calling me months in advance, asking if I would be available for planned leaves or professional development days. Teachers started requesting me specifically when they needed extended coverage, knowing that their students would be in capable hands. But the real validation came from the children themselves. In every classroom I entered, I found handwritten notes tucked into desks, artwork created during lunch breaks, and small gifts made from construction paper and glue. Children who had been told they were behind or difficult were discovering that they were actually capable of remarkable things when someone believed in them and taught them appropriately. At PS 87 in Queens, a 5th grade class had been struggling with a science unit on ecosystems. Their regular teacher had been out for 2 weeks, and the substitute before me had simply assigned textbook reading and worksheet completion. The children were bored, confused, and convinced that science was beyond their understanding. I transformed their classroom into a living laboratory. We built terrariums from recycled materials, creating miniature ecosystems that we could observe and study. We tracked the growth of plants under different conditions, documented the behavior of earthworms and crickets, and recorded our observations in scientific journals. What had been abstract concepts in a textbook became concrete experiences they could touch, smell, and analyze. They learned about interdependence by watching how changes in one part of their terrarium affected everything else. They understood photosynthesis by measuring plant growth in different light conditions. They grasped the concept of food chains by observing the feeding relationships in their mini-environments. When their regular teacher returned, she found a classroom of budding scientists who were excited about their learning and eager to share their discoveries. The test scores from that unit were the highest the class had achieved all year, but more importantly, several students told her they wanted to be scientists when they grew up. Each successful assignment built my reputation and my confidence. I was proving, classroom by classroom, that Margaret Sullivan wasn't too old, too outdated, or too inappropriate to work with children. I was demonstrating that experience, creativity, and genuine care for student learning never go out of style. But the most powerful validation came from an unexpected source. During my 3rd month of substitute teaching, I received a call from a principal in Westchester County. A teacher at Emma and Jacob's school had heard about my work through professional networks and wondered if I might be available for a long-term assignment. Jennifer had been wrong about me being bad for children. The question now was whether I was ready to prove it in her own backyard. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in February. Dr. Patricia Hawthorne, the principal of Westchester Elementary Academy, spoke with the kind of desperation that had become familiar to me over the past few months. Their 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Williams, had been in a car accident and would be out for at least 6 weeks. They needed someone who could step in immediately and maintain the high academic standards their school was known for. "I've heard remarkable things about your work," Dr. Hawthorne said. "Several principals have described you as the best substitute teacher they've ever worked with. We need someone who can do more than just keep the children occupied. We need someone who can actually teach." I accepted the assignment without mentioning that I knew the school well, very well. It was the same prestigious private academy where Emma and Jacob were students. where Jennifer served on the Parent-Teacher Association, where I had once been welcome at school plays and field day events, before being deemed inappropriate for my own grandchildren. That weekend, I prepared for the assignment with the same meticulous attention I had brought to every classroom, but with an additional layer of emotional significance. I wasn't just preparing to teach 22 fourth graders. I was preparing to prove, in the most public way possible, that Jennifer's assessment of my abilities had been catastrophically wrong. I arrived at the school early Monday morning, driving through the familiar gates and parking in the visitor's lot, where I had once parked for Emma's kindergarten graduation. The building looked exactly the same. Red brick facade, perfectly manicured grounds, the kind of educational environment that screamed privilege and high expectations. Dr. Hawthorne met me at the main office, a tall woman with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to running a tight ship. "Mrs. Sullivan, thank you again for taking this on. I should warn you, this is a very demanding group of students. They come from highly educated families with very high expectations. Some of our substitutes have found them challenging." She led me through hallways, lined with student artwork and academic achievement awards. I recognized some of the spaces: the library where I had once read to Emma's class during volunteer reading week, the gymnasium where I had watched Jacob's basketball games, the cafeteria where I had eaten lunch with both children during their early elementary years. Room 204 was a bright, spacious classroom with tall windows and modern learning centers. 22 desks were arranged in collaborative groups, and the walls were covered with evidence of serious academic work: writing samples, science project displays, mathematical problem-solving strategies. These were clearly high-achieving students with demanding parents and elevated expectations. As the children filed in that first morning, I scanned their faces for any sign of recognition, but found none. Emma was in 3rd grade and Jacob in 5th, so there would be no overlap with my 4th grade class. But I knew that word would spread quickly through the school community, and it would only be a matter of time before Jennifer learned that her inappropriate mother-in-law was now teaching in her children's school. The morning began with what I had learned to call the testing phase. These were sophisticated 10-year-olds who had been taught to evaluate adults quickly and efficiently. They had clearly developed strategies for managing substitutes, and they began implementing them immediately. "Mrs. Williams lets us choose our own reading groups," announced Madison, a confident girl with perfectly styled hair who was clearly accustomed to being in charge. "We always do our math homework in pairs," added Christopher, a boy with expensive sneakers and the kind of entitled attitude that came from never being told no. "Substitutes usually just let us work on our independent projects," chimed in several other voices. I listened to their attempts at manipulation, with the amused recognition of someone who had seen it all before. These children were testing boundaries, trying to establish control, and hoping to coast through however many weeks I would be there. They had probably succeeded with previous substitutes who were intimidated by their affluent backgrounds and articulate challenges. But I hadn't spent 34 years in classrooms to be outsmarted by a group of privileged 10-year-olds, no matter how sophisticated their strategies. "That's interesting," I said calmly, moving to the whiteboard. "Let me tell you what we're going to do instead." I began writing a detailed schedule that incorporated challenging academic work, creative projects, and collaborative learning experiences. "We're going to have the best 6 weeks of learning you've ever experienced." The resistance was immediate and vocal. These children were not accustomed to having their preferences dismissed or their suggestions ignored. They had learned to negotiate with adults, to present logical arguments for why their way was better, and to appeal to higher authorities when necessary. "My mother is on the school board," Madison informed me. "She expects me to be challenged appropriately in my learning." "Then she's going to be very pleased," I replied, handing her a reading assignment that was 2 grade levels above what she had been doing. "Because you're going to be challenged in ways you've never experienced before." By the end of the first week, I had completely transformed the classroom dynamic. The children who had expected to coast discovered that I demanded their best work. The students who had been bored by repetitive assignments found themselves engaged in complex, multi-layered projects that required critical thinking and creativity. The class that had been managing their substitute teachers was now being expertly managed by someone who understood exactly how to channel their intelligence and energy into meaningful learning. I created a cross-curricular unit that integrated literature, history, science, and mathematics around the theme of immigration and cultural diversity. Students researched their own family histories, interviewed relatives about their ancestors' journeys to America, and created multimedia presentations that combined storytelling, data analysis, and historical research. The academic rigor was intense, but so was the support. I differentiated instruction to meet each child's needs, providing extra scaffolding for those who needed it, and additional challenges for those who were ready to push further. I established classroom norms that emphasized collaboration, respect, and intellectual curiosity. But it was the personal connections that made the real difference. I learned that Madison's confidence masked anxiety about living up to her older siblings' achievements. Christopher's entitled attitude was a defense against feeling overlooked in a family where academic success was the primary measure of worth. Each child had a story, a set of needs, and untapped potential that previous teachers had never bothered to discover. By the third week, something magical was happening. These children, who had been described as, quote, challenging and demanding, were producing work that exceeded grade-level expectations. They were collaborating effectively, supporting each other's learning, and demonstrating the kind of intellectual engagement that every teacher dreams of seeing. Their parents began to notice. The homework coming home was more sophisticated, the dinner table conversations more substantive, the enthusiasm for school more genuine. Parent emails to Dr. Hawthorne went from complaints about substitute teacher quality to praise for the exceptional learning environment in room 204. Dr. Hawthorne herself began stopping by the classroom regularly, not to check on problems, but to observe the remarkable transformation that was taking place. She watched as I guided students through complex problem-solving processes, facilitated deep discussions about literature, and created learning experiences that challenged every child to reach their potential. "I've never seen anything like this," she told me privately during the fourth week. "These children are performing at levels we usually don't see until 5th or 6th grade. Whatever you're doing, it's working." What I was doing was exactly what I had been doing for 34 years. Treating children as capable learners, setting high expectations, providing necessary support, and creating classroom environments where every student could thrive. The methods Jennifer had criticized as outdated were producing results that exceeded the school's already high standards. But I knew the real test was still coming. Word was spreading through the parent community about the remarkable substitute teacher in room 204. It was only a matter of time before Jennifer heard about it, and when she did, she would have to confront the uncomfortable truth that her inappropriate mother-in-law was being celebrated as exceptional by the very community that had embraced Jennifer's parenting philosophy. The confrontation I had been unconsciously preparing for was finally about to arrive. The moment arrived on a Wednesday afternoon during my 5th week at Westchester Elementary Academy. I was working with a small group of students on an advanced mathematics project when Dr. Hawthorne appeared at my classroom door, accompanied by a woman I recognized immediately. Jennifer's best friend, Patricia Monroe, whose daughter Olivia was in my class. "Mrs. Sullivan," Dr. Hawthorne said, "Mrs. Monroe would like to speak with you about Olivia's progress." Patricia Monroe was everything Jennifer aspired to be: perfectly polished, socially connected, and supremely confident in her opinions about education and child-rearing. She had been Jennifer's ally in many of the subtle campaigns to marginalize my influence with Emma and Jacob, always ready with supportive comments about modern parenting approaches and appropriate boundaries. "I've been hearing remarkable things about your work here," Patricia said, her voice carrying a note of surprise that bordered on disbelief. "Olivia comes home every day excited about what she's learning. She's never been this engaged in school before." I continued helping students with their work while responding to her comments. "Olivia is an exceptional learner," I said. "She has tremendous analytical abilities and a natural curiosity about how things work. She just needed opportunities to explore more complex concepts." Patricia's expression shifted as she processed this assessment. For years, she had been told that Olivia was bright but unfocused, a child who needed constant structure and simplified assignments to succeed. Now she was hearing that her daughter was capable of exceptional work when given appropriate challenges. I have to ask, Patricia said, lowering her voice, are you by any chance related to the Sullivans in Forest Hills? Jennifer Sullivan mentioned that her mother-in-law was a retired teacher, but she paused, clearly struggling with how to phrase her next words diplomatically. I am Margaret Sullivan, I said simply. Emma and Jacob are my grandchildren. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and then a dawning awareness of the implications. She had been witnessing my professional excellence firsthand, praising my methods and celebrating my results. But she had also been part of the social circle that had supported Jennifer's assessment of me as inappropriate and bad for children. I need to make a phone call, Patricia said abruptly, and practically fled from the classroom. I knew exactly who she was calling. Within an hour, my phone was buzzing with a text from Michael. Mom, we need to talk. Tonight, my house, 7 p.m. The drive to Westchester that evening felt like traveling back in time. I had made this journey hundreds of times over the years, but never under these circumstances. I was no longer the dismissed grandmother arriving for supervised visits. I was the acclaimed educator who had become the talk of the school community. Michael answered the door with an expression I couldn't quite read. Part embarrassment, part confusion, and something else I couldn't identify. Mom, come in. Jennifer's in the living room. Jennifer was sitting on the edge of the couch, her usually perfect composure clearly strained. She looked up when I entered, and for the first time in months, I saw uncertainty in her eyes instead of the confident authority she had wielded during our previous encounters. Margaret, she said, her voice carefully controlled, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. What misunderstanding would that be? I asked, settling into the chair across from her. Patricia called me this afternoon. She said you've been teaching at the academy. Jennifer's voice carried a note of accusation, as if my professional success was somehow a betrayal of her authority. I have been substitute teaching, yes, for the past 4 months. It's been very rewarding. Michael shifted uncomfortably. Mom, why didn't you tell us you were working again? You made it clear that my involvement with children was inappropriate, I replied evenly. I found a place where my skills were welcomed and valued. Jennifer's composure cracked slightly. Patricia said the children in your class are performing at exceptional levels. She said other parents are requesting you specifically for their children. That's correct. But you said, we discussed. Jennifer struggled to find her words. You were interfering with Emma and Jacob's development. You were using outdated methods that confused them. I looked at her steadily. Jennifer, what exactly did Patricia tell you about my work at the academy? Jennifer's face flushed. She said you were the best teacher Olivia had ever had. She said you were challenging the children in ways that made them excited about learning. She said you understood each child's individual needs and adapted your teaching accordingly. And how does that differ from what I was trying to do with Emma and Jacob? The question hung in the air between us. Jennifer opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. Michael looked back and forth between us, clearly beginning to understand the magnitude of what had transpired. The difference, Jennifer said finally, is that you're their grandmother, not their teacher. You were overstepping boundaries. Was I? I asked. Or was I trying to share with my grandchildren the same gifts that other people's children are now benefiting from? I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder I had brought with me. These are letters from parents whose children have been in my classes over the past 4 months. Would you like to hear what they have to say about my outdated methods? I opened the folder and began to read. This is from Mrs. Chen at PS 201. Mrs. Sullivan transformed my son's attitude toward learning. He went from hating school to asking for extra homework. Her methods are innovative and effective. Jennifer's face was growing paler with each letter I read. This is from Mr. Rodriguez at IS 145. My daughter has learning differences that previous teachers couldn't address. Mrs. Sullivan understood her needs immediately and created strategies that helped her succeed. She's the most skilled educator we've ever encountered. I continued reading letter after letter, each one praising the same qualities that Jennifer had criticized. Parents celebrated my ability to connect with their children, to challenge them appropriately, to understand their individual needs. They described me as patient, innovative, and exceptionally skilled at making learning relevant and engaging. Michael's voice was quiet when I finished. "Mom, these letters are incredible. Why didn't you tell us about this?" "Because," I said, looking directly at Jennifer, "I was told that my approach to children was harmful. I was told that I was confusing them with outdated ideas. I was told that I was bad for kids." Jennifer's composure finally crumbled completely. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I thought I was trying to protect Emma and Jacob. I thought you were being too demanding, too academic. I thought children needed more freedom to develop naturally. And yet," I said gently, "the children in my classes thrive when they're challenged appropriately. They become more confident, more engaged, more excited about learning. Isn't that what you want for Emma and Jacob?" The room fell silent. Jennifer sat with her head in her hands, and I could see her struggling with the realization that she had been catastrophically wrong. She had pushed away someone who could have enriched her children's lives immeasurably, all in the name of protecting them from an imaginary threat. Michael spoke first. "Mom, I owe you an apology, we both do. We should have trusted your judgment. You've been working with children successfully for decades, and we acted like we knew better." Jennifer looked up, her eyes red with unshed tears. "Margaret, I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I was so wrong about everything." The apology I had been waiting for had finally arrived. But as I sat there looking at my daughter-in-law's devastated face, I realized that vindication felt different than I had expected. It wasn't triumph I felt, but sadness. Sadness for the time that had been lost, for the relationships that had been damaged, for the opportunities that had been missed. "Jennifer," I said softly, "I don't need you to apologize for protecting your children. I need you to understand that I was never a threat to them. I was their grandmother who wanted to help them learn and grow, just like I've helped hundreds of other children do the same thing." "What can we do?" she asked. "How can we fix this?" I looked at both of them, these two people who had hurt me deeply but who were now genuinely remorseful. "We can start over," I said. "We can remember that we all want the same thing, for Emma and Jacob to be happy, healthy, and successful. And we can trust that I know something about helping children achieve those goals." But even as I spoke the words of reconciliation, I knew that something fundamental had changed. I was no longer the dismissed grandmother begging for access to her grandchildren. I was Margaret Sullivan, the educator whose reputation was spreading throughout the school district, whose methods were being celebrated by parents and administrators alike. The question now wasn't whether Jennifer would allow me back into Emma and Jacob's lives. The question was whether she was ready to admit that her children's grandmother had something valuable to offer them after all. 3 months after that pivotal conversation in Jennifer's living room, I found myself standing in the most unexpected place, the front of Emma's 3rd grade classroom at Westchester Elementary Academy. Mrs. Peterson, Emma's regular teacher, had requested me specifically for a week-long assignment while she attended a professional development conference. "The children have been so excited," Dr. Hawthorne told me as she walked me to the classroom. "When they heard Mrs. Sullivan was coming to teach them, several students asked if you were the famous substitute teacher they'd heard about from the older kids." I had indeed become something of a legend in the school. My success with the 4th grade class had led to a permanent position as the school's preferred long-term substitute. Parents requested me by name, teachers sought my advice on challenging students, and administrators relied on me for the most difficult assignments. The outdated methods Jennifer had criticized were now being studied and implemented by other educators. But this assignment was different. This was Emma's class, and Emma didn't know I was coming. As I entered the familiar classroom, I saw her immediately. My granddaughter, sitting at a desk in the 2nd row, her blonde hair in the same braids I used to help her make. She looked up as I walked in, and I watched her expression change from polite curiosity to shocked recognition. "Grandma Maggie?" she whispered, using the nickname she had given me as a toddler but hadn't used in over a year. "Good morning, Emma," I said with a warm smile. "I'm Mrs. Sullivan this week. I'm here to teach your class while Mrs. Peterson is away." The other 21 students looked between Emma and me with fascination. Word spread quickly through the classroom that their substitute teacher was Emma's grandmother, and suddenly I found myself navigating the delicate balance between being a professional educator and a family member. But Emma's reaction was what truly mattered. After months of being told that her grandmother was too much and inappropriate, she was seeing me in the role where I had always belonged, as a teacher who was respected, admired, and trusted with children's learning. Over the course of that week, I watched Emma discover who her grandmother really was. She saw me challenge her classmates to think critically, support struggling learners with patience and creativity, and create learning experiences that made even the most reluctant students excited about school. She observed as her peers competed to sit near me during story time, raised their hands eagerly to participate in my lessons, and lingered after class to ask questions about everything from science to literature. On Wednesday, during a particularly engaging lesson about ecosystems, Emma raised her hand with a question that made my heart soar. "Mrs. Sullivan, how do you make everything so interesting? Why don't other teachers teach like this?" The question came from genuine curiosity, not from the coached politeness that had characterized our interactions during the supervised visits. Emma was discovering that her grandmother wasn't just a retired teacher, she was an exceptional educator who had gifts to share. But the real breakthrough came on Friday, during our final day together. I had planned a special project where students would create presentation boards about their family's immigration stories, similar to the unit that had been so successful with my 4th grade class. Emma approached me during lunch with an expression I hadn't seen from her in over a year, genuine excitement. "Grandma Maggie," she said, the nickname slipping out naturally, "can you help me with my project? I want to write about Great-Grandpa Robert's family coming from Ireland, but I don't know how to start." For the next hour, we worked together on her project. I watched as Emma connected with her family history, asking questions about her heritage that revealed the same intellectual curiosity I had always seen in her. She absorbed information eagerly, made connections between historical events and personal stories, and demonstrated the kind of thinking skills that had been suppressed during months of age-appropriate activities. As we worked, other students gathered around us, drawn by the obvious warmth and engagement of our interaction. They began sharing their own family stories, and soon our individual project had become a collaborative learning experience about the diversity of American immigration experiences. "You're so lucky," Madison Chen told Emma as we cleaned up our materials. "Your grandmother is the coolest teacher ever. I wish my grandma could teach our class." Emma beamed with pride. Pride in her grandmother, pride in her family connection, pride in being associated with someone her peers admired and respected. That afternoon, as the final bell rang and students packed up their belongings, Emma lingered at my desk. "Grandma Maggie," she said quietly, "I missed you. I missed learning things with you." The simple statement broke my heart and filled it simultaneously. This child had been deprived of her grandmother's love and guidance for months, told it was for her own good, while yearning for the connection that had been artificially severed. "I missed you too, sweetheart," I said, pulling her into a hug that felt like coming home. That evening, Jennifer called me. Her voice was different, subdued, humble, and tinged with something I had never heard from her before: genuine respect. "Margaret, I need to tell you something," she said. "Emma came home today and couldn't stop talking about her week with you. She said you were the best teacher she'd ever had, and she asked why we had stopped letting her spend time with you." I remained silent, letting her continue. "She said you helped her understand things she'd never understood before. She said you made her feel smart and important. She said—" Jennifer's voice broke slightly. "She said you made her feel proud of her family." "Children need to feel connected to their heritage," I said gently. "They need to understand where they come from and what they're capable of becoming." "I know that now," Jennifer said. "I've been doing research on educational approaches since our conversation 3 months ago. I've been reading about the methods you use, talking to other parents whose children have been in your classes. Margaret, you're not just a good teacher, you're an exceptional one. And I kept my children away from you because I was threatened by your expertise." The admission hung between us, honest and raw. "Jennifer, I don't need you to diminish yourself," I said. "I need you to understand that loving children and wanting them to succeed isn't a competition. We can both contribute to Emma and Jacob's development in different ways. I want to make this right, she said. I want you to be part of their lives again, not as a supervised visitor, but as their grandmother. The grandmother who obviously has incredible gifts to share with them. Over the following weeks, I gradually resumed my role in Emma and Jacob's lives, but the dynamic had fundamentally changed. I was no longer the dismissed grandmother fighting for scraps of attention. I was Margaret Sullivan, the educator whose reputation preceded her, whose methods were sought after, whose expertise was valued throughout the school community. Jennifer began asking for my advice on educational decisions. She requested my input on homework strategies, learning activities, and ways to challenge the children appropriately. She had discovered that having a professionally accomplished grandmother wasn't a threat to her parenting. It was an incredible asset. The children blossomed under the renewed relationship. Emma's confidence soared as she tackled increasingly challenging projects with my guidance. Jacob's natural curiosity was rekindled as we explored historical topics together. Both children began to see learning as an adventure rather than a chore, and their academic performance reflected their renewed enthusiasm. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came 6 months later, during a parent-teacher conference at the academy. Dr. Hawthorne was meeting with Jennifer and Michael to discuss Emma's progress, and Jennifer mentioned that Emma's grandmother had been working with her on various projects. "You mean Mrs. Sullivan?" Dr. Hawthorne asked with obvious enthusiasm. "She's one of the most gifted educators I've ever encountered. Your children are incredibly fortunate to have access to her expertise at home." Jennifer glanced at Michael, and both of them smiled. "We're learning to appreciate that," Jennifer said. "We're learning to appreciate her." As I sit in my apartment today, surrounded by thank you notes from students, awards from administrators, and photos of Emma and Jacob proudly displaying their latest academic achievements, I reflect on the journey that brought me here. Jennifer's criticism had been intended to diminish me, to push me to the margins of my grandchildren's lives. Instead, it had forced me to rediscover my professional identity and prove my worth in the most public way possible. I had become exactly what she said I never could be, their favorite teacher. Not just Emma and Jacob's, but hundreds of children who had benefited from my outdated methods. I had shown an entire school community that experience, creativity, and genuine care for children's development never go out of style. And in the end, the greatest victory wasn't proving Jennifer wrong. It was proving that Margaret Sullivan still had something valuable to offer. The children I taught knew it, their parents knew it, and finally, thankfully, my own family knew it too. Some battles are won not by fighting directly, but by simply being so undeniably excellent that opposition becomes impossible to maintain. I had found my way back to my grandchildren, not by demanding access, but by becoming someone no one could ignore. I was their grandmother, their teacher, and their biggest champion. And I was exactly where I belonged. Chilla Merle. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Bagabble.